bees, period. So I'm a queen producer, a queen breeder down on the coast, and it keeps me busy 7 days a week. So, okay, how do we turn this thing on?
Natural beekeeper too, right?
What's that?
Do you call yourself a natural beekeeper?
No, I call myself a chemical-free beekeeper. I don't use chemicals to control the varroa mites, but I am not natural. Nothing about what we do with honeybees today is natural. So, can everybody see that? Is that okay? So, dark in here, isn't it? Let me find the button to move this. So, I was asked to come talk to you about a piece of equipment that I created years ago and won an award with. But part of what I wanted to do was kind of tie it into why I created it to start with. And so I took an article that I had wrote for the American Bee Journal that was published a while back and kind of tied it into this as well. So what I want to do is talk about respecting bee space. So we all learned in bee school about Langstroth and the knowledge, and he figured out that even in the wild, bees leave a bee space between combs, okay? And so when you do a cutout, you see it naturally, no matter where they're at in the wall, and sometimes if they're in a wall, it may be only 2 combs, but there is a bee space that we learned about and then we forget about. So beekeepers sometimes, so here's I got these off of Google. These weren't mine. Here's a couple of oops that were done by beekeepers that, you know, in 1903 or something, a fella named Julius Hoffman actually created a new end bar for our frames. Prior to that, the Langstroth frames had no bump out on them, so you had to manually space them into there. So Julius Hoffman made the new end bar, so when you bump them together, it leaves the bee space of 3/8 of an inch, right? Well, when you don't bump them together, the bees are going to fill that gap with comb. It's too much. So, and when you don't bother to put frames in the box at all, the bees are going to build comb wherever they want to do. So, just a couple of, and this top one here, guess they didn't have any bottoms for them frames, so they just put them in without them. So, but yeah, run out of equipment, had bees, why not? So, anyway, so we create our own problems, and I want to talk about, a lot of times, we're mixing manufacturers. Oh, is that bothering you? I didn't want to click it for fear that it might blow something up here. So sometimes we mix manufacturers because they got a sale on something, and so we buy it, and we combine equipment from one manufacturer to another. But you got to keep in mind that not all rabbits or ledges that the frame sets on are the same depth. And the end bars don't have the same height or thickness on them. So sometimes when you use the wrong equipment with the other equipment, you wind up causing a problem, because when then you put your inner cover on, when you see this situation, propolis, the bees can't get between the inner cover and the hive or the frame top, and so the beetles have been chased into there, the small hive beetle, and the next thing you know, they have created a jail until you pop the inner cover off, and that's why you see all of them beetles running around, because they got created into a jail. That's what all this is about. So when you see in that, you need to look, what's the problem? Can we fix it? So this is all about fixing it. So other problems, queen excluders. I know they're making these plastic ones now. And they're cheap, but the problem is, if you lay that plastic one on the frames and it sags because it gets hot into there, look at how much space you have limited the bees to be able to get from the brood chamber into the honey supers, okay? So, same thing here. They're limited to, they can't go in between when this lays down on the top of there, you got about 1 bee space instead of the whole space coming out. So a couple of fixes that are easy would be to simply put a shim underneath of those. And yeah, I got some of these plastic ones, they were cheap. And I just build a shim, 3/8 of an inch shim, that allows the bees to use the whole queen excluder. You put a 3/4 or 3/8 of an inch on the underside of your inner cover, and it lifts it up and you don't wind up with a problem. I usually wind up, beekeepers get tired of keeping bees, or this ain't really what they wanted, and the next thing you know, they're leaving their bee equipment on my shop door or something, and sometimes I don't even know who it come from, but it's different manufacturers, so I gotta go in, modify, so I don't wind up with a problem, okay? So, so now we get down to what I did. We create our own. When you look here, this is how, and not everybody uses pollen substitute or pollen patties. I'm building up bees in the spring to start mating nukes, and so I usually need to feed a pollen patty. I put dry pollen substitute out, but on them rainy, cold days, they can't get out and get to that, and they need protein to feed, develop, and larvae. So, pollen patties, for years, they're designed to lay right on top of the frames and let the bees come get them, okay? The problem is, the small hive beetle that is overwintered with your bees, they love pollen patties, and you did away with the bee space, and they get between the pollen patty and the wooden frame, or plastic, either one, and they're raising beetle larvae, and so not good for your colony, okay? So, because I have about 100 mating nukes that I get set out in the spring, I'm usually feeding nukes pollen patties. So what I did was I took an old hive body, this one was rotten, I was taking it out of service, and put it on the table saw, and the measurements are based on where there wasn't any nails. That's the only thickness requirement. There wasn't any nails in the way for me to saw off. And so I sawed a couple of those and then cut some scraps, and I actually made, put some runners across and stapled some 1/4 inch hardware cloth onto there. And so what this does is it floats that pollen patty up where the bees can protect all 4 sides of it, and so they get what they need, and I'm not raising small hive beetles. That make sense? So, if you're going to use it, though, there's some couple of, and I brought a small one for a nuke that anybody want to look at later. What you don't want to do is have this pollen patty touching the wood any place, because then even a little 1/8 of an inch spot, you get a hive beetle in there laying eggs. You can use it flipped upside down if you want to, or topside. And if you were going to make your own pollen patties, some people make them and they just put a big wad into there. You got to remember, when you put the inner cover down, you don't want to do away with the bee space on the top side of that pollen patty either. That make sense? So,
Eric, so
yes.
the beetles can't walk on that hardware cloth, they don't have enough grip?
Well, they can get right onto here.
But it allows the bees to defend it?
This is 1/4 inch hardware cloth, and the bees can go through it. So they'll just keep chasing the beetles. The point is, the beetles don't get to stop and lay eggs.
Gotcha.
At all. And so, I actually put mine underneath this on a 10 frame colony. I put it on top of the brood chamber and then put my inner cover, and this is how I feed my bees, so I don't have to fill this up, take the inner cover off to fill up in the cold. And with a pollen patty feeder on, when you're pouring syrup in, you can look down in and see, do I need to put a new patty on? Nope, they still got a piece, keep on going. So, but anyway, if you're interested, there's an article in the American Bee Journal in January 2022 that'll tell you how to make it. I did not patent it. I've had beekeepers from Texas, build thousands of them, contacted me and said, do we need to pay you? Nope, build what you want. I even had a beekeeper from Australia send me an email and said, hey, we found your article, we got a hive beetle problem. Is this been patented? No, sir, build all of them you want. So I got an email back from Australia with pictures of them. They painted them like a bluish purple, and you could see every colony in this field had a pollen patty feeder on. But, so, 2021, Dr. Tarpey sent out to a bunch of master beekeepers an application for the American Beekeeping Federation. They were offering first time a practical beekeeping idea award, won nationwide, came with $2,000. I just had a shoulder replaced. I was sitting there left-handed. Took me about 45 minutes to do what should have took 5. I wrote 2 little paragraphs, sent 2 photographs, and in November they sent me an email and said, hey, congratulations, you won the thing. So, but anyway, so, and no, I didn't patent it on purpose. In fact, the article that I wrote tells you how to make them. That way, I'm looking to help beekeepers keep from having small hive beetles raised. So, that's what I'm all about. I don't need a job. I need something to do, okay? So, and I'm not gonna, if you wanna purchase them for, I don't think he's making nuke sizes, but David Bailey at Bailey Bee Supply in Hillsboro asked me, could he build them, sell them, and I said yes, and he said, all right, for every one that he sells, he's sending $1 to Dr. Tarpey's Apicultural Science Fund. Kim?
I will be at Bailey's Bee Supply at 10:30 in the morning.
There you go. If you want to buy them. So anyway, that's, I needed to add some additional time onto there. That's about what I had for you this evening. But what I do want to do is open the floor to any questions on anything. I mean, I drove an hour and a half. If you got a question on something that I can answer, I'm right here.
I guess one thing I probably want to double check on you, that's a winter tool, because you're not concerned about them building any bird cones.
Right, so you want to remove it, and I missed that, yes. So normally we don't feed pollen patties until early spring, when your colonies are building up and maybe it gets wet and cold and they can't get out and bring in the pollen that they need to make brood food with. So that's when you're feeding pollen patties in the early spring. But you gotta watch, you don't wanna leave it onto there, because this dead space, yeah, you'll go into there and it'll be full of comb and honey. So make sure that you know when the flow's coming. That's another reason I like to put it on and then have my feeders on top, because I could keep an eye on that. When in the early spring, my bees quit taking syrup, I take the feeders off. Because when they ain't took no syrup for 3 days and the sun's shining, guess what? They're finding something. They're gonna be filling up this burr comb. One year I left them on too long, they built combs into this upper box. So yeah, that'll teach me to go out of town for a week at the wrong time of the year. Yeah, so, and they were gorgeous looking combs too. They were straight, tied all the way around. Yeah, what a mess.
So your pollen patty thing is underneath your inner cover.
Yep.
Okay, and then your box is on top of your inner cover?
Yes.
And your feeder is in that box?
Yes. So, I don't like to, and this type of feeder, the frame feeder they call them, they were created for commercial beekeepers to put down into the brood chamber, okay? But you gotta remember, commercial beekeepers don't, as a rule of thumb, keep their bees in cold weather. So if they pull that inner cover off to fill it up with syrup, no big deal if they're sitting in Texas or Florida or whatever, getting ready to move their bees to California. But here, when it's 30 degrees outside, I don't wanna pop that inner cover to be feeding my bees. I don't know, I've only been down in Jacksonville about 37, almost 38 years, but our normal winter is about freezing, give or take at night, and in the mid-50s in the daytime. When the sun shines on these hive bodies, them bees will come up here. They got no problem, even if it's 30 degrees. I can go in there to open that up. If the sun's shining, it's warm enough, they're up in this box getting groceries out of that feeder. So I choose to feed in an empty box. Never am I feeding while I have honey supers on. So if I just take my honey frames out and store them, then I've emptied the box, so I don't need additional boxes. So, Kim.
So you've got a little block of wood in there where the notch is on that inner cover?
Yep, I don't use yes, right
So
here.
when you pull that box and that feeder off, you just pull that little block off?
No, that block stays there permanent.
all the
So
time.
if I'm building inner covers, I don't put the notch. If I'm buying or somebody left it or whatever, first thing I do is plug it up and paint it. So, I don't use the upper entrance, so, not at all. They don't need it around here. Maybe up in Minnesota or someplace where it's cold and they get snow down, they need something up top, but no, I don't use it, so, but, yep. So, scrap. I have a cabinet shop, or what's left of it, since I don't build cabinets anymore, so there's scrap in the shop. Gotta do something with it other than burn it. So, anybody else got a question? I'm gonna leave this out in case you wanna come look at it. It's cheap, it don't cost you nothing to look.
So why don't you tell us about chemical-free beekeeping?
Ooh, that's a whole nother PowerPoint. But here's what I'll tell you. Who takes the American Bee Journal? 1, 2, 3. So, those of you that don't, you can go in, log into Daydant or the American Bee Journal, and you can go to archives. And anything that's a year old, you can go read any article in the magazines that are more than a year old, okay? So, June of 2021, I have an article in the American Bee Journal that talks about how I keep bees without using chemicals and control my varroa mites, okay? There's also a link in that article to my research that I did with Dr. Tarpey that's been printed internationally by the International Bee Research Association out of London. And if you're interested, you could go read that as well. So, and I'll give you a little bit about my research. The books have said, and the oldest book I have is a 1917 copy of the ABCs and XYZs of bee culture. And no, I wasn't here when they published it. But, so somebody gave it to me. But so in my getting ready, forming my hypothesis and flipping through, even in 1917, the books have said when a queen gets old and her pheromones get weak, the bees replace her, and we call it supersedure, okay? It's still being printed in textbooks today. Maybe a little bit different wording, but that's what they're saying, based on the queen's pheromones. Based on my observations over the years, I didn't think that was correct. So I designed a research project, bounced it off of Dr. Tarpey, and in the spring of 2020, when COVID was coming along, in fact, when it was hitting the radio, I was in Georgia buying 45 packages of bees. I did a research, and I proved that the absence or lack of brood pheromone has more to do with queen supersedure than the queen's pheromones. So, yep, it's all out there. So maybe what the book should have said for well over 100 years, the queen gets old, she lays fewer eggs, therefore there's less brood pheromone in the colony, and the bees supersede her and make a new queen. So, but, yeah, anyway, so that research is actually, it's in the May of 2021 is the article on my research, but I waited to put the how do I keep bees chemical-free control my varroa mite. I didn't put it out until I had the issue that the other one was printed in to put the link to it. So, but anyway, you can go read that as well. That answer your question? And if you have questions about that, you can go, if you need to get a hold of me, go to the ncbeekeepers.org website, go to the About thing, drop down to leadership and scroll all the way down to the master beekeeper coordinator. I have an email address there, my address is there, the whole whatever. Send me an email and ask me a question and I'll get back to you. I'll let you know what's happening, so, okay? Yes, ma'am.
Do you do anything for condensation in the hives in the winter?
Yes, and I didn't plug my computer in or I would show you. What I do is, you know, popsicle sticks, and I don't throw them away. You can take a popsicle stick and just snap it in half, and if you'll lift the back corners of your inner cover, in this case, we got more than inner cover here, but let's say this feeder wasn't there, just lift this corner and slide a popsicle stick in. It gives about a 1/16 of an inch gap. The bees, and normally you don't have a condensation issue until late January, early February, when the bees are building up. It's getting cold outside. So pests can't get in. It's too cold for the bees to propolize it, and it allows a little bit of an airflow across the front. And that's the only thing that I do. And we have had warm enough winters for about 5 years now that I haven't even had to do that because it's been too warm in the wintertime. So
You say it's too cold for them to propolize it?
yeah, there's nothing blooming that's got sap outside, so
Okay.
they don't propolize that gap. So if you do it too soon, if you did it now, they'd propolize that gap and you've got no airflow coming through. So yeah, but yeah, in January or February, last thing they're worried about is finding something to propolize that gap. So, but anybody else? Yes, sir.
My approach is very similar to that. I call them shims that you can buy to put like pollen patties under. I take them and on all 4 sides, I'll drill 2 half-inch holes and I'll cut a little piece of screen wire and staple it on the inside. Use them in the winter just above the inner hive cover and both under the outer hive cover. And you can see about a semicircle of that, and they don't propolize them. I get just a little bit of airflow, but I'm not getting real cold stuff in there. And like you said, if I pop that top on a warm day, that top will be full of bees in there.
Oh yeah.
And they will try to propolize it if you leave it on too long in the spring, but when it's cold,
Sure.
I've not had any trouble at all.
I'm cheap. I'm a retired Marine. I don't have the kind of money to get drill bits and whatever. So then I got popsicles.
You just chew through there.
I save them back up and I collect them back up. I got a Ziploc bag full of, at one time I had about 300 colonies of bees, and I'd go through and what happens to one usually happens to every one of them. What I do in the fall, and I did it in September this year, a little early since I was having a shoulder replaced, I go around and I put a feeder, an empty hive body and a feeder on top of all of my colonies. And even if I'm not feeding them yet, that way in January, when I decide, hey, I need to give this colony some groceries, I don't have to drive 12 miles back to the house to get a feeder. It's already there.
I do the same thing.
Yeah.
I leave an empty box up there and put the feeders inside and just let them have it.
Yeah, it works good for me, yeah, so, and if you had this type of a feeder with what they call the cap and the ladder, if you put it on and then you go to check it and it's full of dead bees, they've drowned, you waited too long to feed because they're all trying to get into there and they're pushing their sisters into the syrup. So you're better off to feed a little bit earlier. I don't know about here, but we had a really long, I have some scales underneath a colony in 4 different apiaries. And this year our flow terminated on 6th May. 7th of May, it started dropping the weight by about 2 pounds a day, which means that they're eating more than they're bringing in. It should have been about the 15th of June. So we had an early dearth show up and it stayed dry all summer, and then come fall, it didn't rain anything. October, we got 0 rain at my place. Goldenrod was blooming, but not producing, and them bees ate through a lot of dang honey this summer. And there's beekeepers down along the coast that are calling me or emailing me saying, my bees have starved already. I had a couple of small nukes that were stacked up that, yeah, I had them starved to death while I was in the house whining because I had a shoulder. Yeah, so anyway.
It's funny you said that, because I've got a lot of goldenrod on my property, and while it was beautiful this spring, the only thing I saw in it was a couple of yellow jackets.
It's got a root about 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch deep. And if you don't get some surface moisture on it, it blooms and it looks nice, but yeah, it don't produce nothing, so.
And it's
yeah.
funny, Eric, I've inherited several of those inner hive covers, and I did the same thing. I cut a block of wood and stapled it in the gap and caulked it, and I've been doing great without them.
Yeah, there's a way of sliding the inner cover one way or the other. I ain't got the time, so I don't use the upper hole, so, they're kind of meant, a true hive cover, now this is one that I built, but a true hive cover, the thickness is thicker on one side, the gap on the other, and some places you actually roll the hive cover over and put the hole down in the wintertime. But again, I just plug it up, forget about it. Everybody gets treated the same way and go from there. So, but anybody else?
I've seen several of mine for the first time. I mean, been doing this now 12, 13 years. And the queens are not laying, and there's no brood, and I'm not seeing the queens. And I'm seeing it in the other beekeepers too. Is this a result of what you just described with the season thing?
Yes, and let me roll this back as well to my research. During the dearth, no groceries coming in, bees start cannibalizing eggs, larvae. If it gets bad enough, they uncap and start taking pupa out. So, pretty soon, there's no brood pheromone in that colony. You don't know how many people's queens get superseded in the summertime because there's no brood pheromone. And then you go in, gee, there's no eggs, I can't find a queen. You probably got a queen if they're not meaner than fire ants. She's out trying to make mating flights, and guess what? When the dearth, if it's bad enough, they need drones in the air anyway. So yeah, them queens aren't real good when it comes fall. Yeah, so the dearth has a whole lot to do with queen supersedure. John Harris, bee inspector for me, he calls me and he don't bother me. Don't send this to John. But he calls and he got the same problem down in Bladen County that I'm having up there. People calling me saying, hey, got any queens? No, why? Well, I don't have any queen laying in there and I can't find her and she was marked and yeah, well, wait a week and check again and oh, I found one. She still ain't laying, but she ain't marked. Yeah, well, they superseded her because, so my breeder queens, because I do artificial insemination of queens for genetics, and my breeder queens and my drone colonies, I need them to continue to raise, to lay, and the bees to raise bees right on into the dirt. So I cheat a little bit. I put this empty box, and I don't put this feeder. I put a quart jar that's got 3 little holes in it, only 3. So it's kind of a trickle feeder. And I'll put it over that inner cover hole, and it's just enough coming in that the queen will keep laying. These other colonies, they'll keep raising drones. But you gotta be careful if you're gonna do that, because while they're raising bees, they're raising mites. So, but mine are varroa sensitive hygienic. I'm doing mite counts every 30 days through the season. I know, hey, they got the mites under control, so I want them to keep raising bees so that I can still keep grafting, raising queens, and marking and harvesting drones. So, does that make sense? But yeah, a little bit of a trickle feed in the winter, in the summertime will help. But again, if you got mite problems, the last thing you want to do is keep them raising. Sometimes a dearth will help with your mite situation because you get a brood break. So, yeah. So anyway.
So we don't panic at this point, we just kind of go on.
I wouldn't panic, but I would plan on, if you got a colony that superseded their queen in late fall,
Right.
how well she mated, who knows? I would personally plan on finding a queen and being on the list to get a queen next spring and requeen it, because she only mated with 1 or 2 drones. She may not last very long come spring. So She'll be in there laying January, February, March. You'll open it up in April and go, oh, she's quit. Or they'll make a new one for whatever reason. So, but yeah, the bees can look at a queen and go, yeah, let's replace her. Queens look pretty good to me, even when they're not very good. So, who else?
What's your opinion on 2-to-1 or 1-to-1 feeding?
Syrup. So,
Fall, particularly.
here's my opinion, and I think there's a lot of anecdotal information have been put in textbooks over the years. Somebody with a big name one time said, hey, if we mix this syrup down to a 1-to-1, it's thin like nectar, and the bees will take it and will stimulate brood rear. No, the pollen coming in is what stimulates brood rear, not the syrup that you're feeding them. So, I personally believe that if you got to feed bees, there's two reasons to feed bees. You either just put them in their package or a swarm, and they got no dang resources, and you got to feed them, or they're going to starve to death. Or you got bees that have run out of groceries, and they're going to starve to death. So either way, they're on welfare. If you don't feed them, they ain't going to survive, right? Why would you thin that syrup down, and they got to deal with all of that water? I never mix and feed syrup less than a 2-to-1 or even thicker. I put as much syrup in there as I can agitate into the water, and that's what I feed, because they're getting all the carbohydrates and they're not having to deal with all of that water. Believe me, you feed a 2-to-1 syrup in the spring, them bees are going to build up just as fast as they would with a 1-to-1, but they ain't dealing with all of that moisture. So that's my thoughts. And I have a big 65-gallon tank on the back of my bee truck. I'm feeding, because I'm breeding and raising queens, I'm feeding bees somewhere year round, and it's always a 2-to-1 syrup or thicker. So yeah, they don't need a 1-to-1. They don't need all that water. Especially if people say, well, I'm gonna feed a 1-to-1 syrup starting in February so that I can get the bees to stimulate and build up faster. Really? And now you're asking me, how do I ventilate my hive? Because I got all this moisture into there. Hello, we did it to ourselves. That's what this was all about, right? So, yeah, so I only feed a 2-to-1 syrup. Just because somebody says it's time to feed bees, if your bees got enough groceries, don't waste the dang sugar syrup. Honey has a pH balance of about 3.9, has amino acids and fatty acids and lipids and pollen particles in it that the bees need to keep their gut microbiome healthy. Sugar syrup has a pH balance of 7 and nothing but carbohydrates. It'd be like you eating lettuce from October to February and hoping to come out healthy on the other end. So, yeah. There ain't no sense putting it on if they don't need it. But if they need it, don't walk away. I tell new beekeepers, I'd rather see you overfeed a colony of bees and they swarm on you than you to underfeed them and they starve to death before they ever got to spring. So, it's all a management strategy, and we all got to manage them. I can't tell you what to go feed your bees because they're in your yard. I don't know what's around you that they brought in. I can advise you, though, that I'd put it on there and see if they took it, and if they took it, it's because they needed it, and I'd keep putting it on till they quit taking it. So, that make sense?
So you're saying don't just do syrup, do pollen patties too?
No, I'm saying if you're going to feed pollen patties, this is the way to do it. So, not everybody needs to feed pollen patties. I haven't fed pollen patties in about 3 years because our January and February and March has been so warm that the bees are flying every day. The dandelions blooming, the red maples blooming, the henbits blooming. They're bringing it in. I put out a dry pollen sub, and if the bees aren't touching it, there's no sense putting it in the colony either. That makes sense? But if it rains, and the next day they come out, the next thing you know, they'll clean up a couple of pounds of dry pollen patties. And if it's gonna rain for a week, I'll go put a pollen patty in because they gotta keep feeding bees on that rainy week that they're in, or it gets cold, they gotta have it in the box, cause they can't get out and get it. Does that make sense? So, yeah, I'm not saying automatically feed it. You gotta look at each situation. What's the weather gonna do? You know, we know that right after the winter solstice, somewhere about the first of the year, they know that the magnetic pull of the earth has changed, and that queen starts ramping up and they start feeding. And hopefully they stored enough pollen in there that they have some to get, but on them warm days, they're gonna go out and collect more. Usually I'm out on a warm day in January or February when the maple's blooming, the henbit's blooming, the dandelion's blooming. I'll go stand in front of some colonies and count 10 bees. How many of them are bringing in pollen? If you got 8 or 9 out of 10 bringing in pollen, guess what? They're feeding a lot of bees inside. So now you look at what's next week gonna do? Oh, they're calling on a cold week, rainy week. Well, guess what? How much pollen's in there? It's too cold to open up and see. What have they got stored? So to hedge my bet, I go get pollen patty feeders. I'll put a pollen patty on them the day before it starts raining. That way they got some protein in the colony to be feeding bees with when they can't get out and get it. Does that make sense? So, yeah.
Do you
We
make
have
your
one
own?
speaker.
Do
We
you
have one
make your
speaker.
own?
I do not. I buy them. No, I won't say I'm lazy, but I just, no, they sell them. Somebody else gotta make a living. No, they look good when they come in. I can, you know, I use the dial method. I dial up somebody else and say, send me some of these. So, but, yeah, no.
So we had one speaker that talked about taking bananas. You heard it?
Nope, go ahead. I'm
They
waiting.
have the black spots, and they've gotten ripe, but they're not over, they're ripe. And don't peel the banana, cut it, slice it long ways, and put a thing in there, and sit that on top of the frames, with the skin down, and that'll feed the bees.
Well, let me throw this one out. Alarm pheromone, you get enough of it, you get a mean colony sting in gloves, it smells like bananas. You go get your suntan oil that smells like bananas and put it on your hand and walk within too close to your hive, they will attack you because that's what the alarm pheromone smells like. So I have never heard of putting bananas in a colony. That may be the next thing. I don't know. I'm not on TikTok. I'm not on Facebook. That may be the thing that's going on. Kim's first.
Yeah, so that is actually coming out of Africa, where they didn't have the corner Walmart to go get sugar. And they were using what was available in their environments and feed bees.
Yeah, there you go. So I hadn't heard about it before. So, but I could tell you stories about Haiti and what they do in Haiti when I was there in the 90s. And anyway, but yes, ma'am.
So I have a frame in my freezer that has a lot of bee bread in it. If I give that back to them in the early spring, I've seen some things that say that they'll just haul it out of there. They won't use it because it's been frozen, or it doesn't retain its value for a long period.
There has been research done on that, and I can't quote the exact research, but some writings say that pollen is good in the freezer. I've read as much as up to 10 years. There are other people that have done research that say it's not good more than 90 days. So I won't quote any of those, but when I have a colony that, for whatever reason, maybe somebody called late and they need a queen, and shoot, I'm gonna reduce them anyway. So I pull it out and add these frames. I might have some frames of pollen as well. I put them in the freezer, then store them after they've been frozen a while. And I've been known to drop them back in, especially putting them on a swarm helps out. And I don't know, I don't see a lot of pollen pellets out on the ground like you would think they would bring them out and drop them. And they will clean all of that out and next thing you know, there's brood into them cells. So I don't know, my own personal observation is, I have used frames that had pollen that had been in the freezer. I never kept one in there for 10 years, so I don't know what the deal is with that, but, again, I would think, and I'm working on observations here, my personal ones, I would think that if I put a frame of pollen in and they didn't want it, that you'd see a bunch of it on the deck right outside where they dropped it. I don't see that, so.
Do you use solid bottom boards?
Actually, I use a bottom board, it's got a oil tray underneath of it. I put used vegetable oil in there. The small hive beetle, we know that the larva drops to the bottom board, crawls out, drops to the ground to pupate. So I break the brood cycle, they drop into this used vegetable oil, and they don't make it to the ground. So and I bought one from a company, and I think they're in Alabama, years ago, called greenbeehives.com. And then I sourced the wire out of the one place I was able to find it in California. And I build all of my bottom boards. The guy in Alabama only builds for 10 frame and 8 frame, and I got 5 frame nukes and 7 frame for cell builders and 3 frame for artificially inseminated queens. So I build all of my own to include the metal trays. So I don't use solid bottom boards. They've got a tray in them with a 6x6 wire above it that the bees can't get through, but the beetles and the larvae can. So, but yeah, so. And the reason I used vegetable oil, I have a friend of mine that collects it out of fryers all over town, strains it and runs it in his diesel trucks. He got a big tank, so all you gotta do is take the jugs up. So sometimes in the heat of the summer, my bee yard might smell like McDonald's or the local Chinese restaurant or whomever was on the top of that when I poured it in. So, but it works. I get what we call a threefer out of that oil, okay? They cooked with it probably 2 weeks in a row, either way. And then I used it in the bottom board, and when I take it out, I pour it around fire ant piles, and over time, the fire ants are gone too. And it's vegetable oil. It's environmentally friendly. It doesn't kill the ground, but it sure works on a fire ant. So, but, all right, who's next? Look, I've almost used up your time here, huh? You're gonna never invite me back, right? So.
I'll share an observation, Eric. I was telling you about my shims for ventilation. What I do this time of year is I'll put on the left side of the inner hive hole, I'll put about a tablespoon of pollen, dry pollen substitute. On the other side, about a tablespoon spread out, obviously, of just cane sugar. And about every week, I'll just pop the lids and look in there. You don't have to go into the hive. It's amazing to see the variation between what they want, what they eat, the volumes, the types. So to me, it's kind of like giving them options for protein and carbohydrate, and I don't have the moisture to deal with, and it doesn't get, with the ventilation, it doesn't get moist enough in there for the stuff to conglomerate.
Yeah, well, I have tried putting dry pollen sub in here on the inner cover, and I think they're carried it out. Because you never see them on that dry pollen sub packing it into their corbicula. You never see them. And so I put it out on a tray underneath of the roof there, and boy, they're over there packing it in. And when they fly into the hive, it looks like they just went to a flower or something.
Yeah, where do you put it at?
I got a tray that I just pour it in, but it's underneath the roof overhang, so they got access to it and it keeps the rain from getting to it, so.
Oh, you mean you've got a cover over some, okay.
Yeah, so, and even out at my out yards, somebody gave me a bunch of shallow honey supers years ago, and I don't use shallows. So I put a solid bottom board in them, and then across the top of them, I put 2 2x2s, and then I can put a telescoping outer cover onto the 2x2s, and it raises it up so the bees have access. So I set it out at my out yards and put that dry pollen sub into there and put that with a rock on it. And oh yeah, they'll clean it up.
So they got about a 1 or 2 inch gap, they can come in.
Yeah, I use a 2x2 on top, so you just need something to hold it up enough that Yeah,
How
so.
far away from the apiary do you put that?
You could put it right in the apiary because the dry pollen sub doesn't cause a robbing situation
Yeah.
like a sugar syrup or a honey. So you could put it right there, wherever's convenient. Most of mine are outside of the barbed wire fence,
Yeah.
so I don't have to turn the fencer off and open the gate and go in to fill them, so.
20 yards away wouldn't be a problem at all.
No, absolutely not. So if I had my laptop up, I could show you 8 or 9 bee yards. It's got one sitting on cinder blocks. I'm not using them yet, but I just leave the pollen feeders out there.
In
And
winter or year round?
I leave them year round. The first thing you gotta do with them in the spring though is be real, put your suit on.
Yeah.
And, cause they're full of hornet nest underneath
Oh,
there
yeah.
on that, yeah, the hornets have decided. And one year I found a copperhead in there too, so, small one, but, yeah, so. Because there ain't no, the bees aren't going to it and everything else is going, hey, this
Yeah.
looks like
Nice
home.
place to live, yeah.
So, yeah, but, yeah, so that's how I feed, but at the house,
Mhm.
I got a tray right there, just with a couple of them L brackets from Lowe's, shelf brackets, and I just dump,
No, I understand
about
exactly
a
what you're
pound
saying.
on
It
and
keeps
spread
it
it out.
dry and it keeps it available.
yeah, and well, and that tells me when the bees at the house are on the dry sub, I need to go fill up all them other feeders, but there ain't no sense running out,
Checking
doing a 40-mile round trip just to go out there to fill up when, if they're doing it here, they're doing it out there. If they're not doing it here, they,
It's
yeah.
it's a great indicator.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah, so, but, James,
I've heard you talk about all types of feeding other than fondant.
you know, I know people feed fondant, I don't know, some people are feeding a dry sugar as well. I've seen where people are pouring sugar on newspaper. You just gotta keep in mind, from all that I've researched, bees need moisture to process that dry sugar. So, if you're ventilating your colonies, cause they got too much moisture in them, maybe you don't need to put the dry sugar in. Either that or quit ventilating or whatever. So fondant, I know they go get it. It's more of a pain for me to try and go find fondant and mix it or whatever. And so easier for me to go to Walmart and all of the looks as you're pushing a 300-pound cart of sugar out. They think you're mixing shine or something. You know, they're just looking at you like, you're a sorry individual. Are you on the moonshiners or whatever? So I ought to put a sign on the cart. I'm feeding honeybees and just have them people go away. So, oh yeah, I've had some comments in Walmart. So, and from people that probably don't belong in Walmart and what they're wearing. So, but anyway, yeah. So, nobody that was dressed properly would bother to say anything to me, right? All right, who's next? Yeah. Okay, fantastic. Suggestion, if you are not feeding your bees right now, tomorrow you need to be checking them. So, some way, somehow, you need to be checking them and figure out a way to feed them because it's been a long, dry summer. So, yes, sir.
I just share that on mine. I checked my bees in end of September, and there was absolutely no honey in it. So I fed them all the month of October, and now there's plenty of honey in there. But my question is, how long will that last? I got sugar water in there is what they have. So what do I look for in January, February to start feeding or doing something for them?
Well, and again, they're going to start building up. So the books, depending on whose book you read, tells you need 30, 60, 90 pounds of honey to get through the winter. Well, we need more here than they do in Minnesota because them bees cluster and they move real slow. They're not breaking the cluster every day. I got bees flying near about every day of the summertime, which is good. They're able to make cleansing flights and whatever, but they use a whole lot more. So you just got to kind of watch it. When I start feeding bees, I usually leave groceries in there. So when I go checking to see if they need it, if this feeder, and it'll hold a gallon, even if it's only got an inch in the bottom, if they didn't use it all, I don't put any more in. They're not taking it all. But if it's dry, I fill it up. And maybe 4 or 5 days when I come back, now this one's got an inch or two in it and I just leave it. So, but as long as it's sitting there, it's cold enough, it's not gonna spoil, it'll set right there. I can't tell you how much you're gonna need in January, February, or March. I usually play with mine. I go feed them, and maybe in January, instead of filling this up, maybe I only give them a half a gallon and see are they gonna take it, if it's dry. You with me? And if they don't take it, they got enough down below. So, yeah, that's the hardest thing. How much honey do you leave? How much do you feed them to keep them from swarming, to keep them from starving? Yeah, that's a tough one for every beekeeper. So, and it's based on your area too. You know, we got people down there that are living up in old subdivisions that have been there for 60 years. And when they planted some ornamentals in that subdivision, you know, them people, they get a summertime honey flow that nobody else in the county's getting, and they're extracting honey all summer long from these ornamentals. Now, it don't taste very good, but it's honey. So, but yeah, so I can't answer you how much you're gonna need. If you put some syrup in there, believe me, if they don't have room for it, they ain't gonna take it. So, and I'll give you another heads up that I do. If I've been having syrup set into there all dang spring, somewhere the middle of March, I know the flow should be coming in 2, maybe 3 weeks. I don't put any more into there and I take this off. So let them eat what's down there to keep them from swarming. And sometimes I still gotta chase them into a tree. So, but yeah, if you leave it there too long, things will start blooming way before you realize it. So, but when it starts blooming, yeah, if you got this sitting there, they're probably gonna go for the natural to start with, but then they get, gee, it's raining today and we got this setting up top. Let's go fill up where mom ought to be laying eggs, and next thing you know, and I'll guarantee they're gonna land 5 feet higher than your tallest ladder on the property. It happens. Yep. So, who else? All right. Well, thank you for inviting me. I hope I gave you something to talk bad about me later. So, everybody enjoy Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's. Who's going to spring conference in March?
Where is it?
It's in Monroe. It's a joint North Carolina, South Carolina conference. So, it ought to be a good one. I think it's the 5th, 6th, and 7th, or 7th, 8th, and 9th. That first full, you go onto the state website, it's listed out there. But yeah, it'll be a good one. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.